Good evening. I'm Andy Agafangelo. I'm proud to be the founder of the certified social enterprise that is the Transparency Task Force. After a long career in the financial industry, I decided to set up what became a campaign organization in 2015, the Transparency Task Force. Its overall purpose is formally about helping to reform the financial sector so that it serves society better. That's a very broad remit, but it's also a very, very important one for reasons I'll come on to shortly. We have approximately 5,000 people around the world who receive our weekly newsletter, the wonderfully entitled Transparency Times. We see transparency as a powerful agent for change. Nothing new in that. Way back in 1914, the American Justice Louis Brandeis wrote a book all about malpractice in the banking sector, as it happens. And within that book, he made reference the first time to the phrase that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And that little phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant, is very much at the epicenter of our core purpose, which is to drive greater levels of transparency, accountability, scrutiny, truthfulness, and trustworthiness into the financial sector. The finance industry is pretty interesting for many reasons. One of them being a rather bizarre disconnect between two facts. First of all, it is a industry that is completely reliant upon being trustworthy. If you think about it, if you take trust out of financial services, you have absolutely nothing left. I think the Latin credere is the root of the word credit, and that piece of Latin talks about something being believable. You know, we need to believe in the financial sector for it to exist, and certainly for it to be trustworthy. So that's one fact. The other fact is that the financial sector is notoriously prone to misbehaving. When I say misbehaving, I mean a kind of malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, mis-selling that is at the root of all kinds of issues, much of which revolving around misbehavior by all kinds of organizations. What you're about to look at, folks, I'm going to share my screen here. What you're about to look at is something that I think is very important. It's the new global database being launched today that is Violation Tracker UK. And Violation Tracker UK, as its name suggests, is a means by which people can track violations around the world. Here it is, Violation Tracker UK, Violation Tracker Global, an evolution of the US version of this database and also the American version of this database. It's a very, very powerful database. It includes infringements against the regulatory authorities in many, many countries around the world. I'll put a link to it in the chat. You might find it very, very interesting. And I'll just very quickly show you that the database is phenomenally easy to search. And I'm going to show you a particular search just to prove that point. If we click on advanced search, which I think you can see on the screen here now, click on advanced search, you've got so many different search options. We can go to, for example, this section called offense categories. And if we go there and click on that area, we can go to, for example, anti-money laundering deficiencies. It's one of many things we could search on that's relevant to tonight's conversation. We click on search. We immediately get to data, which is great to see. The data in this particular search is ranked according to the size of the fine. So Binance Holdings Limited infringed against a US authority, total fine 4.3-ish billion, not million, billion, for anti-money laundering deficiencies. And if you can scroll down, you'll see there's lots and lots here. One of the concerns we have as a campaign organization is the at least appearance, probably a reality, but I won't state it as fact, at least the appearance that some parts of the banking and financial services sector seems to be remarkably lax when it comes to scrutinizing the work of the baddies. Hence, things like the Mexican drug cartels laundering money and that kind of stuff. What I have a complete and utter blind spot to is the topic we're going to be discussing tonight, that Justin will be describing, if you like, the cyberspace dimension to all this. I know diddly squat about it, new technical term, diddly squat. Um, but I do think that Jeff is going to be educating me and hopefully many of us tonight. Let me tell you a little bit more about his book, because it's a book that I think is phenomenally relevant to what we are all talking about tonight. I'll just read out some information about the book, and I'm telling you where I'm getting this information from. I'm getting it from the Amazon page. I do encourage you all to think about buying the book. I'm sure it's full of information you'll find remarkably interesting. I've just put a link to it in the chat. And if we go to the web page we've created for the event, which I'll also put a link to in the chat, I'm just going to read out part of the narrative. And this will, of course, explain in very precise terms why the work of Jeff White is phenomenally relevant to the Transparency Task Force community. So I'm about to read out. For as long as people have been stealing money, there has been an industry ready to wash it. But what happened when our economy went digital? How does the global underworld wash its dirty money in the internet age? Rinsed reveals how organized crooks have joined forces with the world's most sophisticated cyber criminals. The result? A vast virtual money laundering machine too intelligent for most authorities to crack. Through a series of jaw-dropping cases and interviews with insiders at all levels of the system, Jeff White shows how thieves are uniting to successfully get away with the most atrocious crimes on an unprecedented scale. The book follows money from the outrageous luxury of Dubai hotels to sleepy backwaters of coastal Ireland, from the back streets of Nigeria to the secretive zones of North Korea, to investigate this new cyber super cartel. What a great phrase, a cyber super cartel. I get that. Through first-hand accounts from the victims of their devastating crimes, White uncovers the extraordinary true story of high-tech laundering and exposes its terrible human cost. I'm going to speak a little bit more about that terrible human cost because all of the work of the Transparency Task Force is somehow linked to trying to drive real change in areas that really do matter. And some of you will be aware that an area that we really do think really matters is that point made in the narrative I've just read out. I'm going to give you some context here. Last year, I flew up to the funeral of one of our volunteers, not only one of our members, but one of our volunteers, Ian Davis, who was a wonderful human being, past tense note. Ian took his own life. He hanged himself. He hanged himself because he became the victim of a major fraud that not only impacted him, but also literally thousands of other people by way of the London capital and finance scandal. And we know, as a matter of fact, that for about 2.5, 3 years after he lost a huge amount of money, basically his entire life savings, just as he was approaching retirement, we know that Ian spent up until typically 3 o'clock in the morning trying to piece together evidence to give to the authorities to help them understand what had gone on in relation to this scandal, in an attempt to get the authorities to catch the baddies and hopefully help him get his money back. That last bit never happened because Ian quite literally lost the will to live in that process. And what you're looking at here, folks, and I'll put a link to it in the chat, is the the statement in Parliament that was supported by many parliamentarians, the folks that you can see here. And the key message in that statement is that it calls upon the authorities to work better together to try to mitigate the risk of people becoming victims of financial crime, but also to better support them if they unfortunately do become prey to those horrible, horrible people. So what Jeff's going to be talking about tonight is not some abstract notion that's of interest from a kind of thought curiosity point of view. It's real stuff that really matters because it affects real people, people that might be our brothers, our sisters, our mums, our dads, our sons, our daughters, our volunteers, our members, our constituents, if you're a parliamentarian. So, like with all of our events, there's some purpose to this conversation we're having tonight because we need to learn. We need to learn what's happening to have a reasonable chance of doing something about it. And that's why I am off the scale grateful to Jeff White to coming to talk to us tonight about his book, Rinsed. I'm going to pass over to Jeff in just a moment, but folks, just before we do that, can we please not only show our appreciation by applauding in the normal way for Jeff's time tonight, but also for all the life experience that's gone into his book that he's injected into that narrative so effectively. So please do join me in thanking Jeff for his time tonight. Jeff, over to you, sir. Take the conversation anywhere you want to go. We're a very informal bunch, and folks, feel free to pop things into the chat to express comments, concerns, ideas, challenges, and I'll bring those into the conversation as we go. Thanks, Jeff. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for that kind introduction. And hello and good evening to all of you, wherever you're joining from. So yeah, I'll make a few introductory comments and then we'll sort of take the conversation wherever you guys fancy taking it, really. Just to give you a bit of background for myself. So I'm an investigative journalist, and what I look into is the links between organized crime and technology. So it's organized crime and tech, and whatever those two things cross over. Traditionally, of course, that would have been computer hacking, and that is still the case. It's still something I cover. But obviously, as our world has become increasingly technologically dependent, most forms of organized crime will have some touch point with technology, whether it's people trafficking gangs using encrypted apps to communicate, or whether it's drug dealers using dark web sales platforms to sell their wares. Increasingly technology is overhauling and impacting on the world of organized crime, just as it's impacting on all of our lives as well. The way I got into all of this was, for a long time I was at Channel 4 News. I was a tech correspondent at Channel 4 News, and started trying to work out how I could look into hard news stories to do with technology. Just to give you an insight as to how television news works, you have an on-air time and an off-air time. And so for Channel 4 News, obviously the on-air time is 7 p.m. The off-air time could be 7:52 and 35 seconds. And at that point, somebody flicks a switch and the program's over. You can't expand it like you can with a newspaper or a podcast or a blog or whatever. You have a hard stop. There's a running order of events in the program. And what I found was technology stories often sat at the bottom of that running order, particularly when I started in this about 15-ish years ago. They were considered the sort of light-hearted subjects at the end of the program. It was the era of the Apple product launches and so on. The consequence of that is if you're at the bottom of the running order and something important happens during the day and goes in at the top, which often it does, you get dropped off the bottom. And I got kind of tired of being dropped off the bottom. I also got tired of doing light-hearted tech stories. I didn't get into journalism to cover somebody else's product launches. It felt like we were doing PR for the tech companies. And so for all of these reasons, I wanted to start doing hard news in tech. And then I started attending these conferences, cybercrime conferences, cybersecurity conferences. I started looking into tech fraud. And I realized that actually that there were some serious stories out there. People were losing real money. Governments, companies were getting hacked into. And so I started doing investigations, harder and harder news investigations at Channel 4 News. And that's how I sort of got into the kind of cybercrime, cybersecurity beat, as it were. Turned out to be a very fertile time to do that. We had obviously the leaks from Edward Snowden, the former US National Security Agency contractor. We obviously had the anonymous movement. You may remember them. We also had the break-in of Sony Pictures Entertainment. We had the US presidential election in 2016, all of which were stories where technology sort of became a massive part of the story. Cambridge Analytica, part of this as well. The sort of data usage by Cambridge Analytica and Facebook's involvement therein. So I've started covering cybercrime, cybersecurity, and looking at all sorts of different aspects of that: government hacking, organized crime, and what are called hacktivists, the sort of anonymous movement of people, often young men, who are, in a way, hacking for kicks. Through all of that, I started covering the story of North Korea and how North Korea became a computer hacking superpower. It's a very unlikely story when you think about it. I mean, there are about 25 million people in North Korea, most of whom don't have a computer, let alone access to the internet. And those who do have a computer and access to the internet are given it by the government, and it's very strictly monitored. And yet, if you ask the august folks at GCHQ to sort of list the top four cyber threats to the UK, North Korea is often in that top four. And the story of how that happened became a BBC podcast called The Lazarus Heist, which was out a couple of years ago. And I wrote the book called of the same name, The Lazarus Heist. What's interesting about North Korea is that, on the one hand, they are doing the same thing all government hackers are doing. And yes, we have them in the US. Every country worth its salt has government hackers. But North Korea is also behaving very differently to the way government hackers normally do. They're hacking for cash, often, is the allegation. And that comes down to the fact that North Korea has basically gone broke. It's quite hard to work out how North Korea survives as a country. Well, the accusation is that North Korea sends its hackers out to break into financial institutions and steal money and take it back to the regime to help support that regime. And of course, to buy the nuclear weapons parts and the missile parts that North Korea likes to use. And so through all of that, you can look at North Korea as a nation state threat, but you can also look at it, frankly, as an organized crime gang. It does the things organized crime gangs do, and it steals money, and therefore it's a financial organized crime gang. And so it has to launder its money. Now, in the case of North Korea, it's an interesting crossover between laundering tactics and sanctions evasion tactics. When I talk to people about North Korea, depending on who I'm talking to, they say, oh, well, you're looking into sanctions evasion there. But exactly the same events could be looked into by a different set of people to say, well, you're looking into money laundering. And so I got quite interested in this. I got quite interested in how North Korea goes about laundering its money. Because laundering it has to do, it's got to somehow get the money out of these financial institutions, move it, hide it, and extricate it, which is the classic sort of trail of money laundering. And what I found interesting was, I think I had this idea when I first started out, which perhaps you do, that computer hackers are these immensely gifted young individuals who, with a few lines of code on a screen, can spirit your money away and you never see it again. That's not entirely true from my experience. Computer hackers are very good at getting into places, including banks and financial companies. That's what hacking is about. If you want to understand the sort of DNA of hacking, the soul of hacking, it's about getting somewhere you're not supposed to be. That's the idea of hacking, and everything about hacking is that. I've got a closed door in front of me. How am I going to get through it? But when the hackers find their way into the banks or people's bank accounts or cryptocurrency companies, they didn't necessarily know what to do next with the money once they got their sort of digital hands, if you like, on the money. Because obviously it's a different set of skills. Hacking is about understanding computer code. It's about understanding server architecture and different software versions and understanding vulnerabilities. It's a whole bunch of skills behind that. But that's different to financial skills. Hackers don't necessarily understand how the SWIFT transfer system works, how money muling works, how to create bank accounts, how fast a payment works. All of that financial sort of criminal knowledge isn't necessarily what hackers understand. So time and again, I found that when these hackers sort of did their work, they would rely on this sort of symbiotic relationship with money launderers, to do the work. And North Korea is the classic case for that. Time and again, North Korea, excuse me, North Korea has used money laundering networks to escape with the money. And what's interesting is, if you look at the Lazarus Heist podcast, for example, it was 20 episodes across 2 seasons. On the surface, it looks like a story about cybercrime in North Korea. But actually, if you concentrate, about half of it is actually about money laundering. How do you get away with the money? How do you escape with the money? And those were some of the most interesting parts of the story for me. There's an amazing story about a North Korean job in 2016, or a hack on a bank called Bangladesh Bank, the national bank actually of Bangladesh. The hackers tried to target $1 billion from that bank. They tried to steal that. One of the most famous hacks of all time. In the end, they got away with about $81 million, but they still had to launder that money. So they sent it across to the Philippines to a bank with a complicit bank manager who extracted it in cash, helped them extract it in cash. They then put it into casinos and gambled it through casinos in order to launder the money, to wash it of any connection to the crime, and then extricate it. And that money's gone. The $81 million is gone and has never been seen again. And these were fascinating stories, these stories of money laundering. So I found it interesting how computer hackers worked with money launderers. Now, the money launderers they're working with are generally technically very skilled people. We're not talking about people going into, a bank with a suitcase full of money. We're talking about people who understand, high-tech banking, who understand online account creation and cryptocurrency. So naturally, your hackers, because they're dealing in stolen digital funds most of the time, are ending up working with high-tech money launderers. But then the more I looked into this, the more I realized that actually the sort of high-tech laundering scene was being used by all types of criminals. Drug dealers, prostitution rings, child sexual abuse gangs, fraudsters, people traffickers. Increasingly, the money that comes from those organized crimes is being put into digital format and being laundered by the high-tech money laundering gangs. So if you like, the money laundering is the sluice through which most of these organized crime gangs funds are going. And as money's become more digitized, as our economies become more digitized, increasingly the money laundering job is a high-tech job. So that's what made me want to look at money laundering in itself. I initially pitched the book to Penguin as a book about money laundering in general, and it was Penguin's suggestion, actually, the commissioner there, who said, "Well, let's look at tech. You've covered tech, try and focus on that," which was a smart move in the end because it forced me to sort of focus on those kind of high-tech money laundering networks. So I wanted to look at money laundering. I wanted to explain to the public how money laundering worked, and I wanted to look at how technology was influencing that, rocket fueling it, as I've described it in the book. One of the reasons I wanted to do that was when I started looking at money laundering, it felt to me a lot like the cybercrime, cybersecurity stuff I'd covered. In that it was a subject which people recognized that they understood money laundering was a thing. They understood it was a bad thing and a big bad thing. They didn't really understand how it worked. When you got to people about money laundering, they still had that image of the dodgy chap with the suitcase walking into a bank, trying to flood banknotes across the counter. I found it interesting that one of the most successful money laundering stories in fiction is a Netflix series called Ozark, which you may have watched. And Ozark's fascinating. It's about money laundering. It's about a money launderer who ends up working with a cartel. Now, what's fascinating about the series is it really puts money laundering in terms that people can understand. Here's an individual who, against his better judgment, gets involved in this. He's living in a place, the Ozarks in the US, which is a very, homely kind of place. It's the kind of place a lot of people go on holiday. It's recognizable, it's physical, geographical. And the money he's laundering, of course, comes from drug sales, something everybody can acknowledge is a bad thing in society, that were generating cash, and he had to launder cash. So the reason Ozark works is because it makes it very real for people. It's a real chap in a real place laundering real physical money from the sale of real drugs on the street. It's all very physical. And I found that quite interesting. The book. I wanted to call the book at one stage. They said we get sued, so we didn't do that. But what I wanted to do was sort of take that and try and run with it and go, okay, well, how do I write a book then that really puts money laundering in a way that people can understand? It makes it sort of real for people. As I started researching money laundering more and more, I became very frustrated with the sort of coverage in the news of money laundering, because the classic money laundering headline is, Bank X fined for compliance failures. And you'd read the story, and it all sounded it had this feeling of being very significant. I remember there was a big fine on NatWest Bank a couple of years ago, about 18 months ago or so, huge fine for money laundering. And I read it and thought, this sounds like a fantastic story. But then when I read the story, it didn't go anywhere. I couldn't figure out what had really happened. Well, they'd laundered this money and they were fined, but it's a fine for a compliance failure. Well, where did this money come from? And what was the compliance failure? And were there people in the bank who knew what was going on? Do you know what I mean? It had that feeling of a big story, but actually when you looked into it, it all evaporated into this very loose, woolly kind of terminology. And so I realized that a way to make people care about money laundering is to connect it very, very concretely to a crime, and a crime that has consequences for real people. Again, taking a leaf out of that series Ozark. So what I wanted to do was try and go, okay, I'm not going to talk about money laundering yet. What I'm going to talk about is the criminals who do these crimes and predate upon people. And I want to show you that crime, and I want to show you who suffers and how they suffers. And then I want to show you the money that they made from that suffering. Now you care how we launder it. Now you care where it went. If I just tell you about money laundering, you don't care. But if I connect that and you can see who suffered, you are invested emotionally in the story. So what I wanted to do with the book was a couple of things. Number one, I wanted to show real stories of real people. Number two, I wanted to explain money laundering, this quite abstract sort of trade. And number three, I wanted to talk about how technology was changing it. In terms of sort of structuring the book and making it work, I mean, ideally, what you're looking for, what I'm looking for as a journalist, an investigative journalist doing narrative non-fiction, having a story, is one story that you can stay with the whole time. The Lazarus Heist, for example, about North Korean hackers, the Lazarus Group, which is where we get the name the Lazarus Heist, the Lazarus Group of government hackers have been on a tear. For 10 years now, they've been doing some of the world's most significant hacks. So you just follow the story along. You start at the beginning and you just keep following the Lazarus Group and you follow all the twists and turns. It's got that wonderful narrative, chronological structure to it. In the world of money laundering and tech, there wasn't really one gang or one story I could follow along. So structuring the book and trying to work out how to pull the reader through it was a bit of a challenge. I came across my notes actually about a week or so ago from the book, and I'd forgotten how much work I did on that and how difficult it was. And my partner reminded me of how incredibly difficult I was to live with at that time, because I was convinced the book wouldn't work and it wasn't going to make sense, and I couldn't do this. And in the end, what I fell back on, because there's no narrative kind of arc, I thought, well, okay, there's not a narrative arc, but there is a sort of systemic arc here, because money laundering has laundering 101. There are three steps. Forgive me if you already know this, but the three steps are placement, layering, and integration. Placement is getting the money into a financial system, some kind of financial system, a bank, for example. You sell drugs on the street, you make £1 million. You can't sit on £1 million. Somebody else is going to steal it from you. The police are going to steal it, take it from you. It looks suspicious. It's subject to inflation. So how do you sort of deal with that challenge? And actually in the book, one of the things I wanted to start with was a very, very concrete example of why people launder. And the classic example I went for was Pablo Escobar. Again, just really choosing something that the audience can really identify with and really see. Escobar had a huge dealing, and it wasn't the drugs, it was the money. Escobar would take his drugs from Colombia up into the US and sell them for cash. Now, what made cocaine, his drug of choice, of choice, useful, was you could package it very small. Cocaine's an incredible product. You sell a tiny bar of it for, tens of thousands of dollars. But the problem was the cash, even in big denomination notes, was bigger than the cocaine. This leaves you a logistical problem. As a smuggler, you're effectively a logistics person, and moving drugs up north and then getting more cash back was a problem. For every had to get 2 planes of cash back to Colombia. That's a problem. You end up, your logistics is all over the place. Your pieces on the board don't align. So Escobar's brother, Roberto Escobar, became his accountant and started trying to work out how they could make this work. And so I wanted to use Escobar as a sort of starting point. Why does a criminal launder? Well, look at Pablo Escobar. And there was a wonderful story about Pablo Escobar's nephew, Nicolas Escobar, who ends up living in one of Escobar's old safe houses. Obviously, he had safe houses all over Medellin. Nicolas Escobar is still living in this house. And one day he saw a ghost walking through the wall of the house. Escobar was quite phlegmatic about this and didn't see this as particularly weird. He said, well, ghosts exist, but he was intrigued as to why the ghost was walking into the wall of the house. And it happened again and again and again. And in the end, he thought, well, there must be something about that bit of the house. So he measured it, and he discovered that there was a bit of the house that was an unexplained void. It didn't map onto the rooms of the house. So he took a sledgehammer and he smashed into it. And what he found was Escobar's hideout. One of these safe rooms that Escobar would hide in if the police came too close. And as he looked through the safe house, this sort of bit of the house that had been divided off, he came across a huge plastic bin bag. And as he unwrapped it, he realized it was full of money. It's about $18 million of money in the bag. And of course, it's the fantasy dream come true. You move into your old relative's house and you find not just cash in the attic, but millions of pounds of cash in the attic. Problem for Nicolas Escobar was the money had rotted away. As he opened the bag, as he took these banknotes out, they dissolved literally in his hands. And I thought that was a perfect analogy for why criminals launder. You launder money because if you don't, it just sits there. As most criminals accept that they're going to do some jail time. Jail is an occupational hazard for And so you realize you don't have to start again. You don't want to have to earn your money all over again. So another reason criminals launder is so that once they've done their jail time, they can come out of prison and their money is still there because the police can convict the crime but can't connect the crime to the money. And so they can't seize the money. And so the money stays there for once they've done the jail time. So again, it's interesting explanations as to why people launder money. The placement stage, as I say, is getting that money into a financial institution. So you take your cash into the bank or whatever you do. Second stage is layering. Layering is very important because if you just put your cash in the bank and then you get arrested, the police go to the bank and they seize your money. So what you've got to do once you put your money in the bank or financial institution is move it around, wash it around to vanish the trace between the money and the crime. And that way, if the police catch you for the crime, they can't link it to the money, they can't take your money. Once you've done those stages, placement and layering, the final stage is integration, which is spending it. It's the fun bit of money laundering, if you like. Now, obviously you think, well, go and spend it on cocaine and prostitutes or something like that. But the smarter criminals are long-term investing. They will put it into houses, which is what Escobar did. He invested in property, or they'll put it into artworks, or they'll invest it in a business. A couple of reasons for that. If you invest your now washed money, your laundered money, into a legitimate business, you can pay tax on that money. Now, criminals don't like paying tax, but if you avoid tax, you tend to get investigated by the authorities. So being able to pay tax on an investment you've made with your assets is really useful. It keeps the tax man away from investigating you. But also, if you invest wisely in property, for example, your criminal money is then going to grow in value. You've invested. Good money laundering is long-term financial planning for criminals. And again, one of the stories I use in the book is about a chap who did exactly that. He was working for drug gangs and he would take their money and invest it for them and grow their money. He felt he was a financial planner for the gangs. So those are sort of classic stages of money laundering: the placement, the layering, and the integration. And that was my sort of structure for the book is, okay, I'm going to explain to the public, here's how the steps work. And I'm going to look at a case in each of those areas. I'm going to look at a case of placement, I'm going to look at a case of layering, and I'm going to look at a case of integration. And what's vital is we start with the crime and the victim. So one of the first stories I start with in the book is about a drug gang up in Manchester who was selling heroin on the streets of Manchester, getting cash in through the door. And of course, we can all understand the effects of that, of heroin dealing. Some of the other cases I look at in the book are about prostitution. There's a very famous case of a US website that was facilitating prostitution. Again, they made huge amounts of money out of that. I interviewed one of the people who was trafficked. She was trafficked when she was you see that case, they laundered it. And again, you care about the sort of money laundering. So I want to take all these examples of placement, layering, and integration, and then describe from the victim all the way through to the money what that sort of process was. Then what I want to do is show how technology is turbo fueling all of that. So I would say, okay, here's somebody who tried to place their money into the financial system, but here's somebody who used cryptocurrency to do that, and actually that's made it a lot easier for those people. The heroin smuggling sisters I talked about in Manchester, they took their drug cash and they put it into Bitcoin. And what's useful for them is they can whiz that money all around the world to pay off their drug suppliers. But also, it turned out they were paying a fee of 4% to move their money, to launder their money through Bitcoin. That's tiny. I mean, money launderers will charge you sometimes up to 60% to launder money. 4% is fantastic. And for the drug gang, of course, it meant they made hundreds of thousands of pounds more profit because they weren't paying off the money launderers. So I started to show how different criminal enterprises were using technology in these different stages of the placement, layering, sort of integration, classic sort of threefold thing. Now, I would say one of the interesting things about technology and its influence on this is it's made the placement bit of things a bit less common. So previously, if you would sell drugs on the street, you ended up with cash and you had to somehow place your cash into the financial system. You had to get it into a bank or some financial institution. These days, the money is already digitized and you're stealing it in digital form. So you're not having to place that money into the financial system. It's already in the financial system. If I steal money from your bank account and I transfer it to my bank account, I haven't had to place it anywhere. It's already placed. It's already in the financial system. I've just moved it from your account to mine. So the placement stage, when you're talking about technology and money laundering, has started to become less important. But commensurately, the layering stage has become way more important and way more difficult. Because think about that example. If I hack into your bank account and I steal your money, I don't have to take a suitcase full of banknotes into the bank because I've just transferred the money digitally. Nice and clean, don't have to do much placement. But the layering is a problem because the bank can trace the money from your account to my account. There's a trail, there's a paper trail. And the more money's become digitized, the harder it's become for those criminals to take the money and to layer it. Because every time they try and move it around to break the trail back to the crime, there's a paper trail, there's a digital trail. So the new game for money launderers is that layering process, is taking the money and somehow breaking the chain of connection back to the crime. So I tried to look at all of that sort of stuff. Of course, in the book, inevitably, cryptocurrency features largely. In terms of the massive global financial system, cryptocurrency is a tiny part. It's actually a tiny part of global finance, but it's a significant and growing part. And for money launderers and hackers, it's been an absolute boon. Money laundering cryptocurrency rather sits completely outside the traditional financial system. It's still largely unregulated. We've had new European regulation recently, but struggling to keep up with cryptocurrency. And you can basically avoid the bank and the know your customer checks, the anti-money laundering checks. You can go to a Bitcoin broker, you can swap your money into cryptocurrency, and from there on in, you can move it around the world, anywhere in the world, instantly at almost zero cost. It's an absolutely fantastic tool in finance. It's also a fantastic tool for money launderers. Now, the problem with cryptocurrency is, again, the layering. It's breaking the chain between the crime and the money. You criminal money to crypto, or when you steal cryptocurrency, it's traceable. There's a record of it on what's called the blockchain, this ledger, this public ledger, immutable ledger of every transaction. And so when you steal cryptocurrency, if I break into your crypto wallet and I steal all your Bitcoin and transfer it to my Bitcoin wallet, there's not just a trace of it, there's a trace of it on the internet that everybody can see. So again, in terms of cryptocurrency, that layering process has become more and more advanced. There's more and more work going on around that. A couple of the other things I've mentioned is, in terms of looking at fraud in the book, fraud is one of the aspects I look at. At the moment, as I see it in the world, there are kind of two flywheels, if you like, of fraud, two big engines of fraud. Number one is West African organized crime. There's a huge community around West Africa. And I have to say, this is not West Africans per se. There's a tiny minority of people in West Africa, but a significant minority who are doing a great deal of damage in terms of economic crime. And again, laundering their money through these interesting high-tech ways. The other part of this is Southeast Asia, sort of China, and then Laos, Cambodia, the Philippines. There's a huge sort of scam fraud kind of community around there who are targeting people with the kind of investment frauds, cryptocurrency frauds, romance fraud as well is very popular around there. So again, they're using these kind of high-tech sort of means to target people, but also to launder their money. Finally, I just want to wrap up by saying one of the things that I came to at the end of the book was why technology and money laundering sort of go hand in hand. It's not the case, I really will be honest, I don't think it's the case that the people who invent these technologies wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to invent a technology that helps out money launderers. I don't think that's the case. What happens is that money laundering and technology end up inhabiting the same space because they kind of want the same things. If you think of what you want as a money launderer, put yourself in the position of a money launderer. You've got a load of money that you're trying to move around, kind of system that you can put it into where loads of money is sloshing around, where nobody's going to mind or notice if you put in a couple of million of dodgy money. So you want lots of money sloshing about and lots of febrile valuations all over the place. You want a big pile of kind of money washing about. You also want international. You want to be able to deposit your criminal money in London and withdraw it in Los Angeles. The third thing you don't want regulation. You do not want the police and the regulators and the tax people sniffing around. So those are three things you want. You want lots of money, febrile market, you want an international system, and you want no regulation. That's what a money launderer wants. Now think of what a tech startup wants. And you can look at Uber and Airbnb and Booking.com and all these different things. They want the same thing. They want somewhere where there's lots of money sloshing around. Of course they do. Every tech startup wants to be dealing with this vibrant marketplace where there's loads of people investing and pulling money in and out. They want international. They want to launch their app globally, simultaneously. They want the service to be worldwide available. And of course, they don't want regulation. If you think about, Uber and Airbnb, they deliberately targeted areas where regulation was a bit grey, so you can go in and you can dominate and not have to fight against regulation and tick loads of boxes and apply to the government for a license. You just want to get started. So the stuff that technologists really like, the things where tech startups and techies really get excited, happen to be exactly the same territory where the money launderers want to inhabit. And so you get this weird symbiotic, often unwitting relationship between sort of the worlds of tech and the world of money laundering. I've chanted on for a bit there, and I'm going to leave it over for questions and go back to Andy in case there's questions
So,
from you folks. See, there are some in the chat, and I'll leave Andy to
yeah,
moderate.
yeah, yeah. Jeff, thank you so much. That was phenomenally interesting. Before we go further forwards, folks, let's show our appreciation, Jeff. That really was superb. You've crammed so much information into that. Um, you've ended on a topic that is profoundly off the scale interesting to me, Jeff, which is the desire for the baddies to have a deregulatory environment. Um, if I may, I'll go there first of all because it's a topic that's really interesting to us. Allow me to explain why. So, sometime in October, it might be November, we as a campaign group are going to be writing to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's a 7-page-ish document, and it basically says, Dear Chancellor, we understand that you want growth in the economy, and we understand that for the financial sector to fully contribute to that growth agenda, um, it needs to be trusted. Only 11% of data, sorry, only 11% of people, according to the FCA's own data, really trust the regulatory environment and the financial sector. Therefore, it seems sensible to us that if you want growth, you're going to want the financial industry to be properly regulated, for it to be quite firm, and for it to enforce properly and catch the baddies, etc., etc. Therefore, please, 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 Chancellor of the Exchequer, don't go down a deregulatory policy route because, and obviously this is not the phrasing we use, but basically because it's going to bite us in the backside sooner or later. And I don't think we make direct reference to it in the letter, but many of us will know that in the US, they repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, which was a big piece of legislation put in to try to protect the system from the sort of stuff that causes markets to crash. And when they repealed it a little while later, we had the global financial crisis. So from our point of view, Jeff, there's a close link between good regulation that's properly enforced and markets being stable, consumers being protected. Now, am I right in thinking that the baddies often seem to be so far ahead of the curve compared to the goodies? I know I'm being very simplistic here. And that regulators and governments are always playing this catch-up game. And it makes me wonder, is that the reality? Do the regulators often have to play some kind of catch-up game to catch up with the baddies, the criminals, who always seem to be at the very cutting edge of developments, if I can put it that way? Or is that more a myth than a reality? Any thoughts on that general point, Jeff, before we go into other areas, and I invite others to come in with comments and questions. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, it's interesting. In terms of law enforcement catching up with the baddies, what I see is people talk about whack-a-mole, or it's just a case of whack-a-mole.
Yeah,
I don't think that's
yeah,
the right analogy. What happens is organized crime gangs or organized crime methodologies, criminal types, um, grow in impact and size. And the law enforcement starts to see that and starts trying to get involved in it, trying to stop it rather than get into, like the prevention of it. And then you'll see a big takedown. You'll see a huge sort of police operation to shut that particular thing down. Um, and that sort of kills it off for a while. And then another crime gang somewhere else will sort of grow again. So in terms of law enforcement activity, there is law enforcement activity. It's just people don't feel it's frequent enough or big enough. But obviously for the police, they're always a little bit behind the curve because they're always watching these kind of rising sort of crime phenomenon coming up. And once it hits a certain level, then they hop on it. Now, obviously, you want them to hop on it before that happens, but before they don't have sort of foresight for that. In terms of government and regulation, it's interesting. I do have some sympathy for legislators in that you could pass a law now which would govern cryptocurrency as it stands, and somebody comes out with an innovation a year from now which is completely different and completely upsets the apple cart, and your legislation is bust. So as a legislator, you have to really think about how your legislation is going to impact the situation today, but how it can also regulate stuff that's going to come out in the future. The European legislation is called Markets in Crypto Assets. The MiCA legislation is really interesting to try and do that, to try and that phrase crypto asset is a really ugly phrase, like a kind of techie phrase. But what they're trying to say is, at the moment we're dealing with things like Bitcoin and its cryptocurrency. In the future, crypto assets will be other things as well. So in the future, it could well be, there's a possibility that your house will be a crypto asset. So at the moment, you pass your sort of deeds across to transfer your house. There's no reason why that couldn't be a sort of crypto asset. You couldn't sort of store that in the blockchain. And when you sell your house, you actually transfer ownership of it in the blockchain to somebody else. So you see what I mean? Legislation has to encompass these sort of possible future things. Thing is also, legislation is inevitably nation state and hidebound by that. A lot of this activity goes way beyond nation state. And there's a certain amount of techies and criminals being quite smart about playing off different jurisdictions against each other. So, the techies saying, well, hey,
Interesting.
we'll set up shop in your jurisdiction, but if you pass that legislation, I'm afraid this isn't going to work. We've seen that in the UK actually around cryptocurrency, around the government's kind of struggles to get their head around cryptocurrency and to regulate it. And at that point, a lot of the crypto companies said, well, actually, this regulation's too harsh. Maybe we'll just press a button and we'll set up shop over here because our business can live anywhere. Do you want it to live here? Do you want us to live in Dubai? We can transfer. So, and the criminals do that as well. The criminals play off jurisdictions against each other, going where the regulation is weakest and playing off those jurisdictions against each other. So that's what I think. I'm sort of off the top of my head there, but that's what I think.
Thanks, Jeff. That point you make there about the kind of regulatory arbitrage is a real problem. It comes up in so many different areas. It's also a problem that comes up when it's well, how can I say this without being too blunt about it? As no doubt you're aware, the UK's got a bit of a bad reputation when it comes to illicit money flows around the world. Many people talk about that being connected to our colonial past and all the offshore jurisdictions and that kind of thing. It seems to me that the UK ought to be fighting as hard as, if not even harder than everyone else, because we do have that fundamental disadvantage of having been such a major force around the world through our empire with all our overseas jurisdictions. There seems to be a connection, I think, between the illicit money flows, the cyber criminality, the lax tax jurisdictions. It's all like a perfect storm, isn't it, for UK to have a really big problem in this area? That's the impression that we get anyway. Just one quickie from me before we pass on to others. The Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. Many people are saying to us, great big step in the right direction, but doesn't nearly go far enough. Is that something you have an opinion on, Jeff? Have you got any thoughts about what ideally would make improvements in terms of how to regulate and enforce against these baddies?
I mean, one thing I've come across as an investigative journalist again and again is the incredible crapness of Companies House in the UK in terms of
Yeah,
um, I can't see the point of it. I mean, if you can set up a company for 20 quid and register it to a mailboxes, etc. address, what is the point? I mean, I just think we should. I
yeah,
think there should be a different name for Companies House. It should just be a registrationsareus.com or something like that. Really, I mean,
yeah.
what is the point? Um, I know there was attempts to beef that up. Those attempts don't seem particularly sort of cogent for me. As for the act, I haven't, to be fair, I haven't read the act, so I can't comment on that one, I'm afraid. But I'm sure your august guests have their own views on that one.
Thank you very much indeed. You mentioned Cubby's House there. We're absolutely on the same page with you on that. There's a really good comedy sketch. I'll try to find it, which ridicules Company's House. I think it's a comedy program called The Outlaws. I'll try to find a quick link to a YouTube piece there. We've had some wonderful comments in the chat, particularly well, from various people, including Professor James Treadwell, who's with us tonight. James is going to be having a book club event with us next year. James, I'd love to bring you to the conversation in a moment, if you don't mind, because you put some interesting comments in the chat. Would anybody like to come in with a comment or a question? And I'm wondering whether, for example, Mark, we'll go to Bill Burton. I can see your hand, Bill. I'm wondering whether the likes of Nick Howe or James Treadwell or Mark Bannister or others might also want to come in, because I'm sure you've all got interesting perspectives on what's been covered so far. But Bill, we'll go to Bill Burton next. Always lovely to hear from you, Bill. Please take yourself off mute and share with us what you'd like to say. Thank you, Bill.
I'm just thinking all this thing we're talking about is targeting the big people. but some of the trans people like me, I got trans, lost money and a long time ago, and I just think that some of the things that the big companies are doing, there's so multi-million-pound big companies, we can't spot it, we can't report it, so it must be more difficult for countries to identify it. It just seems to be such a big thing about all this fraud that's going on in the world that just reporting multi-million pound, or multi-billion pound. I've only got a few £1,000, so it's I just feel a bit sad about the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. You know what, Bill? It's easy to identify with what you've just said, sir. I mean, I made the point earlier about Ian Davis, rest in peace. Don't want to go over that again because it's too damn sad. But so many people in our community, Jeff, are people who've literally lost big chunks of their retirement money through one scam or another. And you must be right. In probably most, if not every one of those cases, there's got to be some kind of
Yeah,
digital or tech or cyber dimension to it. And isn't it bleeding scary when people can lose tens of thousands of pounds, hundreds of thousands of pounds through some digital criminal doing something shady? So hard to catch them as well, isn't it? Bill, I completely sympathize with what you say there, I,
thank
I,
you.
I really do. Jeff, I mean, there's a lot of pressure on the banks these days, quite rightly so, I would say, to up their game and try to protect consumers. There's new legislation, I think, going through around authorized push payment fraud and that kind of stuff. Um, do you feel, I'm going to ask you a really general question here. Do you feel optimistic that the goodies are going to win sooner or later? If this was Star Wars, light side, dark side, are the goodies going to win in the end, or have we got reason to be miserable forever?
Uh, I don't know. It's a good question. It's a good question. I think the best sort of analogy with this a friend of mine came up with was he said it's like being a gardener. That you will never get rid of all the weeds in your garden, but if you don't try, you end up with just a
Yeah,
garden full of weeds.
yeah,
We've got to sort of come up with an accommodation in terms of how much crime we're sort of prepared to put up with. Obviously, the ideal answer is zero. That's just not going to happen. And it's
yeah,
working out again. It's working out where those big growth areas in crime are. It's like, okay, we can't prevent all crime, but what's the sort of, as I say, there's two big engines in fraud at the moment, and we know where they are. We know what they're doing. That strikes me as a sort of good place to start. So I don't know. I do feel, I don't know what you folks think about this. I feel that the last government, and I presume it'll be the same with this government, started to get the idea, the hang, that economic crime wasn't just a few, people losing a couple of
yeah,
thousand here and there. It was actually like a national security issue, and they were like, okay, we need a
yeah.
fraud strategy. We need to get on top of this. How that beds in, how that works, I don't know. But there did seem to be a bit of acknowledgement that this was a big problem, was actually a national level problem that really needed some proper strategy behind it, as opposed to
Yeah.
just cops chasing things around. That's what I felt.
We're going to hear from Nick Howe in just a moment. Nick, when you speak, please do take a moment to introduce yourself and tell everybody a bit about your background because it's so relevant to what we're discussing. But just before we go to Nick, Jeff, the point you made just now is really good. Um, we got quite close to the work of folks like Emily Thornberry and MP and Tom Tugendhat MP, who was a fraud, I think a security minister. There really did seem to be a bit of an acceleration in the UK's appetite to tackle all this stuff. Some people say brought on because of the Ukraine war, i.e., the Ukraine war meant that the UK had to take a tougher position on Russia and Russian drug money and Russian mafia money and all that stuff, and that kind of precipitated the UK really raising its game. We do really hope that the new government is going to continue with that momentum. I think you make a great point, Jeff. We'll go to Nick Howe. Nick, please do take a moment to introduce yourself to everybody. Folks, we've had a few conversations, TTF, with Nick and his colleagues recently, and they've all been absolutely brilliant. Nick, really pleased you're here. Please take a moment to tell everybody a bit about yourself and your background, and then go into whatever the point was that you put your hand
Okay.
up for. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony and colleagues, and particularly thanks, Jeff, for a fascinating conversation. So my name's Nick Howe. I head up what's known as the Institute of Policing at Staffordshire University, and we're probably one of the largest blended ex-police professional academic team devoted to police education and research anywhere in Europe. Some big investments made by the university. And James works very closely, Professor Treadwell, who will speak shortly. I just wondered, you've given a very sort of systemized way that money laundering works, Jeff, which is revealing and fascinating. I just wondered, in any of your research, did you have much contact with the enforcement agencies in the various forms they take, and their level of conversation that allowed you to write the narrative that you've written?
Yes, is the short answer. So in the UK, obviously, the National Crime Agency has taken the lead on a lot of this stuff because it's able to work internationally and also able to work sort of across the UK, and also some of the regional organised crime units. There is the National Economic Crime Centre within the NCA who handle a lot of this stuff. So sort of, in terms of the individual cases I was covering, I would often speak to the officers involved. And that was a really interesting picture, actually. Just going back to that Manchester case I covered, I talked about these. I haven't gone into the details of it. It's two middle-aged women. They're in their 40s, and they ran a beauty business on the side. Actually, what they were doing was drug dealing. And so these aren't women who you would expect to sort of understand cryptocurrency. But they understood very quickly that this is going to save us a ton on money laundering costs. When I spoke to Manchester Police, who investigated the case, there was this really interesting piece around how they'd looked at the assets of these two women. And they actually gave me a list of all the assets they'd seized: Rolex watches and fur coats and Mercedes cars and that kind of thing. And all that goes across to this place in Ireland where they auctioned it all off, and you can see how much money they got. I said, so what happened to the cryptocurrency? And they sort of said, well, we didn't really sort of bother with that because, we had enough on our plate with the rest of the investigation. And also we could link these assets, these physical assets, to these crimes. The cryptocurrency they really struggled with, despite the fact there are records on the criminals' phones of exactly the cryptocurrency and where it went. And I found that really interesting because people say, oh, cryptocurrency is all traceable, you can recover it. Well, traceable, can you recover it? Now, what's interesting about that is the Din sisters, these two middle-aged sisters, got, I think, 11 years each, something like that.
Wow.
They'll serve 5.5,
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
a bit less for good behavior. When they come out, the Bitcoin's still there. If they've still got the passwords to the wallets, they can still get all that Bitcoin back. So I do think that at the high level at the National Crime Agency, there's this understanding of crypto, and that's feeding down into the forces.
Yeah.
But at ground level, and an investigation like that, the high-tech bits of this didn't really get investigated. And the danger, of course, is these two sisters get out of jail, get their million in Bitcoin, and either vanish or start up in business again. So I don't know whether that answers the question. That's kind of how.
No, it does, and it's part of the world. So what we talk about is the professionalization of investigation, and it's quite clear there's a skills deficit, what I would call the front line. As you say, the top end, they invest in those skills and CPD, but there seems to be a gap and a turning a blind eye because of competing demands and the investment forces would have to make in technologies just to keep up. It was just an observation.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Nick, thank you, and thanks for your interest in our work. And we, as I said, we have huge interest in yours too. Thanks, Jeff. Professor James Treadwell just put something in the chat that I think is really interesting. I often do walk past hairdressers or barber shops that never seem to have any business in them, but they still trade. And maybe what Professor James Treadwell has just put in the chat helps to understand it. Professor James Treadwell, please do again introduce yourself and share anything you'd like to. It's great to have you with us here, Professor James Treadwell.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name's James Treadwell. I'm a professor of criminology at Staffordshire University. Traditionally, I suppose, for the last few years, a lot of my work's focused at and around organised crime. And a lot of it's also involved speaking to some fairly notorious organised criminals in England and Wales, and sort of spending time trying to understand how they've gone about things to the extent that they'll talk to you and so on, but also law enforcement professionals and others. And I think it's really, really interesting. I mean, there's so many things that we could talk to. Jeff, I completely agree on the failures of Companies House. The failures of regulation and regulatory capture, how complicit some of those who are supposed to be providing a degree of oversight are in not doing that. And those are big problems in some ways for law enforcement. Some of the kind of myths, the policing myth that, you know, what we need is always officers on the street, linked to what Nick was saying. You know, I'm not surprised with the Bitcoin and the failure to recover story, because you know, there's literally no digital investigation done on anything at all. So even when you find instances where, you know, one of the most notorious drug dealers in the United Kingdom is caught with a mobile phone in his prison cell, you know, you won't necessarily even have the kind of digital download and the investigatory work done on that mobile phone to look at who it's been talking to. And there's all sorts of, you know, there's all sorts of problems, and they're big and vast. But, you know, one of my concerns is that we've simply kind of made it very, very easy in some ways, particularly out and around the drug market, to launder vast amounts of money very, very quickly. And things like cryptocurrency is an enabler of that. But there is always that opportunity to kind of claw things back, because, you know, the first aspect of that kind of laundering is going to be that most of the kind of drugs economy that you know, underscores a lot of the unexplained wealth starts with the transaction that is, you know, 40 quid or 50 quid exchange for a gram of cocaine, and there will be cash involved in that kind of that exchange very often, and therefore it is kind of possible, if you follow the money, to claw things back. And our place, if the United Kingdom's place for being tolerant not only of our kind of low, our everyday financial crime, just spans right the way upwards, and therefore becomes very tolerant of laundering from other countries on a kind of grand and industrial scale. And I suppose one aspect of that, and it's not something I like to do, because I do like to always remember the victims, but I think we also need to understand why it is sometimes that things like regulatory capture are allowed, why there is a blind eye turned, and it goes back to that the functional way in which it hides other issues and other problems. The high street and unexplained money on it hides the death of the high street. The unexplained money that was in the financial system in 2008 during the financial crisis, you know, drugs money kept the financial system afloat to some extent. And
Wow.
you know, added to that, you've also got, and the example that I was giving of the gold, which was the Brinksmat robbery, at the time the largest robbery of in the United Kingdom, gold bullion valued at millions and millions of pounds that was stolen by 6 armed robbers. Only a number of them identified. Some never were. Interestingly, and I put this in the chat, even some of those who weren't identified ended up paying back something like £6 million in compensation at a delayed date. The main launderer for that became a kind of infamous figure, Kenny Noy, and probably the most kind of well-known organised criminal in the United Kingdom. Noy played a very complicated VAT fraud involving gold and gold bullion exchange, but he also channeled the money into the renovation of Canary Wharf, which made vast amounts of money, so that the crime was very functional to the legitimate economy in some ways, and they go hand in hand. And that's why at times it's very, very difficult to get the authorities to kind of take things seriously, because there's a kind of there's a positive, or they see the positive functions of what that illicit activity is doing as well. The thing is, I think you've got to go back and highlight the negatives as well. And one of the things that comes out, I think there is still something like 15 murders linked to the Brinksmat case and that amount of money laundering. And if you think about the ripples of harm that flow out from it, they're absolutely enormous. Final thing I'll say, when we were researching crimes of the powerful and looking at the kind of systems and the mechanisms that are there just generally for people, we have a very lax system in the UK around things like non-disclosure arrangements. We have or gagging clauses. We have some tremendous legislation to do things like trace unexplained wealth. It's never ever used. Rarely do we ever use unexplained wealth orders on individuals to say, where has this money come from? And yet some things like non-disclosure arrangements are used very, very frequently, even sometimes to shut down victims and people who've kind of suffered legitimately and then been through processes of kind of restitution, but then can't speak afterwards about what's happened and what's gone on with them. So we don't have a great deal of transparency. And the thing I'd say that always comes, the thing that's the best tonic is transparency. When people can't hide what they're doing, the court of public opinion, tends to work quite well. And a lack of transparency is the absolute opposite. So I've talked for ages now, but Jeff, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you ever so much. Yeah, really, really enjoyed it.
You know what? We could spend hours and hours and hours discussing all this. You said a lot that's so relevant. Jeff, to you, please. I mean, please do respond to those thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on this transparency point, which actually was something I was thinking about when I was coming into this and should have mentioned, totally forgot to, but I will mention now. I think it's really important. Um, trying to think how to put this. The folks who obviously we've got all these new cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and so on. Um, and part of the reason for that is because the people behind those technologies are suspicious of surveillance from governments and financial institutions. They see the way the world is going, where cash is going out of style and all transactions in the future will be digital, let's say, um, is what they're working to. At which stage, the opportunities for government and corporate surveillance increase massively. Where in that future world is our freedom and our privacy? And that's part of the logic behind cryptocurrency. There's baked into the DNA of crypto people is this idea of we need money that the government doesn't control. You may have heard of central bank digital currencies being discussed.
Mhm.
This is the idea
Yeah,
that increasingly central banks in different countries will at the moment they sort of print money and they kind of put it out, but they also do the whole management of the economy and money flows into financial institutions. Increasingly, that will turn digital, and the government will be able to keep a track on that. As soon as you mention that, there are people who turn around and say, wait, hang on, you're saying that the government can control money. Will it be able to control how I spend my money? It's not unfeasible, for example, just as a thought experiment, in the future, if the government is able to exert some kind of digital control over money, if people are paid their benefits digitally and if they spend them digitally, could the government say, we're going to prevent you from spending your benefit money on cigarettes and alcohol because we fund you with benefits, but we don't approve of that? That's not an unfeasible scenario. The job of cryptocurrency for some of the people in that community is to push back against that. So when you talk about transparency, you've got to realize that some of the people inventing these new financial systems are seeing transparency as surveillance. So I just want to put that out there as a kind of
wow.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely agree. Although I do tend to think that the kind of libertarian ideology that kind of says these things about, well, the state and its control, yes, the state can be all powerful, but if you look at the kind of unifying branch of those libertarians, it's not just the crypto groups, it's things like Telegram as apps and messaging platforms. It extends into Tor browsers and the dark net and so on. You can also understand why people can get quickly concerned about that kind of move away, and I do get why there is a kind of pushback from this kind of transparency argument, but at the same time. While I get that, I think it's often it's often pushed back by the very rogues and scoundrels sometimes that you don't necessarily want to give greater freedom and liberty to.
Yeah. And I wonder, folks, I wonder if that narrative of, and forgive me, I'm going to be shot down in a minute for being a bit of a Luddite. I wonder if that narrative of we need a digital currency because we've all lost faith in the established order of things and central banks and all that lot. Is that real, or is that rooted in creative justification for creating a world that's easier to do bad stuff in? I don't know what the answer is, but that's kind of what goes through my mind sometimes. I do know that Mark Bannister knows a million times more about this stuff than I do. So let's go to Mark Bannister. Thank you, Mark.
I think that's a slight over exaggeration, but anyway, Jeff, thank you very much for your excellent disposition of the state of where we've got to. I am about to offend everybody. I don't mean to, but I very much view money a bit like religion. There are lots of types of religion. You can subscribe to any which one you like. And it's really about a belief system. And as long as that belief system is intact in all its forms and guises, then money works in whatever format. So digital currencies is no different in that regard to any other faith system that we currently rely on, be it the pound, the dollar, the yen, the Deutschmark. Well, the Deutschmark doesn't exist anymore, but euro and so on and so forth. But what I'm particularly interested in, and I don't know whether you've got anything to offer, is what I would describe as the single point of failure. And the benefit of old money, such as it was, is that, and it's actually slightly destroyed by your story of Pablo Escobar's cousin or nephew or whoever he was, relation, which he opened the bag and all the money fell apart. So what had been a large sum of useful dollars was not anymore. But we in the digital world have a real must have a real concern that our ability to make those connections work and therefore have transferability could easily collapse or be made to go away. And I just wonder whether, in your review and thought about that, whether you've got any insights to share and offer.
When you say to make those connections work, can you say more?
Well, okay. So when you have a physical note in your pocket, you have it, it's yours. In the cryptocurrency world and all of that, indeed, whether you use Apple Pay or any of those things, your money is remote from you. And if those systems are not available to you, suddenly you don't have any money.
Yes, and I think that's that goes back to the point I was trying to make about the concern some crypto people have. It's not all, but some crypto people have about a future of digital fiat money, of pounds, dollars, and yen being digital. Is that access to it can be withdrawn, control over it can be much more easily sort of exercised, and so the idea of cryptocurrencies being peer-to-peer, of them being run by the community, sort of for the community, as it were. There's arguments as to how true that is, but the idea that this is money that nobody and everybody controls makes it much harder to wrest control over something. Say what you like about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. Bitcoin's been around for 2009, so 15 years. Fundamentally the technology behind it, that where transactions move between people and it's all recorded, the technology is actually held fast. And so what people point to is to say, look, we don't actually need governments to control money. We don't, we can do this ourselves, and we can have money that's digital. So we don't have pounds in our hands, but we can have money that can't be taken away from us. That's a huge part of it, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's extremely interesting in that also the authorities, both in Europe and America, are making a massive attempt to wrest control, particularly at the point where the on-off between the transition between the traditional financial world and the cryptocurrency world interfaces. They are making a monumental effort to tie the cryptocurrency folks to their financial system, because they see quite clearly, they see it as such a risk that if they once get away from them, they cannot wrest it back under control. And I think that's actually very viable. But the irony is that in order to measure its value, it's done in traditional currency. So nobody discusses what the price of Bitcoin is other than relative to a US dollar.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is it's a very interesting problem and scenario. It really is.
And this is the thing is you can understand the fear at the heart of government, where if you fast forward to a world where everybody's using cryptocurrency that's sort of controlled by the group for the group, how do you control things like inflation and interest rates? Already, a lot of the young folks that I meet and speak to, people in their sort of 20s and so on, they own cryptocurrency. They will own NFTs. They will own these things. And I think part of the reason for that is people forget, after 2008, we had historically low interest rates for ages. There was kind of no point putting your money in a bank. You didn't earn interest on it. And during that time, a lot of people growing up thought, well, I could get crypto, which is growing in value, or I could put my money in a bank and get 0.1% if I'm lucky. And so, they own cryptocurrency. This is going to become more of a thing. People are going to, I suspect, own more and want to own more cryptocurrency. And so the size of that part of the economy is going to grow. Traditional financial institutions are going to be sort of more exposed to it. But also, I think, in governments, they're looking at that thinking, well, if this becomes a thing, how do we control it? We need to have some way of sort of managing this. It's a tricky one. It's difficult.
There's a really interesting line of thought that James Treadwell touched on earlier. This idea that in some weird warped way, it's difficult to make this point without sounding like a conspiracy theorist or a paranoid nut job, but just suspend disbelief for a minute. There's some weird, unhealthy relationship between certain parts of the legitimate economy with certain parts of the not so legitimate economy. I put a link in the chat just a few moments ago. It's a piece of Transparency International work that refers to the idea that there are many professionals, inverted commas, who act as enablers for dirty money, illicit money flows, and all that sort of thing. But I've seen papers like the Transparency International piece on that topic from loads and loads of different sources. And it causes me to wonder whether the lobbying power of professions such as legal and accounting, which is probably massive and much more than we even think, in a funny, weird way, does that lobbying power enable dodgy professionals to continue to act for their bad money clients, including criminals involved in the kind of criminality that you've been speaking about, Jeff? Is there a tension there between what's good for society and what James Treadwell touched on earlier, this idea that in a funny way, there's almost like a willingness to not necessarily turn a blind eye to it, but to pull your punches on it, to kind of go through the motions of trying to stamp it out and close it down? Or is that kind of imagination land that's not really rooted in any fact? Any thoughts on that, Jeff?
I don't know. It's quite a big question. It's getting kind of late for me, but I think it goes back to one of the points I made earlier. Of compliance failures. The idea that so much this. I think the thing I struggle with most about sort of banking and money laundering, traditional finance and money laundering, there are regulations in place. There are all these know your customer and anti-money laundering rules, all these regulations and so on. But when you actually try and implement them in the real world, the bank says, right, what do I need to do? And you say, well, okay, here's a checklist of things you need to do. And the banks go, great, all right, I've done the checklist. And somehow, the criminals see the checklists and they work out how to get around them. And somehow the mission, the goal of it, of preventing this financial crime, dissolves into just a checklist of stuff, which when you tick it, doesn't actually prevent the financial crime. I don't know why that keeps happening. And people involved in anti-financial crime, part of the reason they're doing it is because they want to stop this stuff. But somehow it all just ends up in in these tick box exercises, because otherwise, how do you implement it? If you're saying to a bank, stop financial crime, and just say, we're not going to give you a list of how you do it, you just have to do it, the bank will say, well, that's not fair. You have to tell us how we do it so we can measure it and you can measure it. So inevitably you dissolve down into this very compliance-based, very tick boxy kind of thing. I don't know how you get around that. I don't know whether the attendees have ideas on that, but yeah.
I don't know how we get around that either. What I do know is that many of our members, and of course, tens of thousands of other people around the country, millions of people around the world, feel a real devastation when they find that they've lost substantial amounts of money as a consequence of the kind of criminality we've been talking about. And there's an inevitability, I suppose, that the better the crooks get at using cyber this and cyber that, the further away they are from being caught and prosecuted. And all the time they continue to be successful criminals, inverted commas, they're effectively adverts to recruit others into that horrible, horrible space that hurt the rest of good society. Jeff, it's been a fascinating session, a session that's opened my eyes up to lots of things I really wasn't aware of. And we're all very grateful to you. We're going to bring the session to a close in just a moment, Jeff, but first of all, we'll invite you to say any sort of final comments you want to make to kind of bring your own thoughts on this topic together. And if you want to indicate anything you may be working on in the future. Over to you, Jeff, for your final comments. Thank you.
That's very kind. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I mean, it's just the fact that groups like this exist are really important. And, the fact that you're speaking to government, approaching government, particularly at this time when there's this whole, there's a new government in place, there's a bit of window to influence things, but also there's this interesting tension at the heart of the government in terms of, we've got troubling finances, we've got this big black hole, we've got to fill it, we've got to grow, and then how does growth bed in, and also how does growth fit with growth, but not growth for criminals and dodgy money and so on. So it's a really interesting, you're at an interesting state at point of flux. I think so. In terms of what I'm thinking about next, wanting to do next, it's funny, only today, I was thinking, I've been researching a book on the subject of ransomware, which is where you sort of criminals encrypt your systems and then charge you ransom to them. And I've struggled with this book, and I struggled with whether it's worth doing. And then I thought, that's not the book I want to do. What I want to do is a book about fraud. I mean, there obviously are other books about fraud, but I just think there's so much territory to go at. So in terms of what I'm doing next, and actually this conversation has made me think that there's so many bits of this, and there's so many people who have a story about somebody. And the tragic story you told at the beginning, Andy, really puts this in context. There are real people at the heart of that, which isn't so much in ransomware. So the conversation's actually made me sort of double down on that. But you never know, maybe I'll get distracted and do something else. But thank you so much for having me. It's been really, really, really great to talk to you all. And if you want to find me on LinkedIn or whatever, or message me there, or my email address and everything's pretty public, so you can get in touch. It'd be great to hear from you all and stay in touch with you all.
Fantastic, Jeff. Fantastic. Please do write a book on fraud. The more exposure there is on that terrible topic, the better. Please do, Jeff. Mark Bannister's itching to come in with what I know is going to be a very short point. Mark, go for it. Go for it.
When you write your book on fraud, Jeff, right? Could I commend you to start with the banks? And I don't say that because this will be a welcome comment amid this community, but actually, ironically, it's all about whether you're inside the club or outside the club, right? And the reality of our banking system is that they operate a very sophisticated system that at its heart has a fraud. Now, everybody here on this call, and quite a lot of you will have heard me say this before, believe that the bank lent you money. It didn't. No bank has ever lent anybody any money, right? They make credit available to you. There is no damn money. I don't want to hear anybody tell me about money. The only thing that is called to money is a £10 note. That's printed by the Bank of England. Well, not even printed by them, but you know what I mean, right? That's money. But banks do credit, okay? And credit is the ultimate fraud in terms of belief systems. It's totally dependent upon it, and it can be manipulated in 1,000 different ways. And so right at the heart of our system, I can see James, he's about to turn into a nodding donkey. But anyway, I don't mean that rudely. I just out of amusement, but it speaks to, so trust me, there's a book that's so needed that's never been written. Just go for it, Jeff.
Thank you.
The fraud that is the banking system. On that really intriguing note, we'll leave it there, folks. Can we show our appreciation to Mr. Jeff White once again? Congratulations on your book, Jeff, and thank you very much indeed for being with us tonight. And good luck with everything you move on to in the future. Cheers, Jeff. Good night, all. Thank you for being here.
Good night. Cheerio.
Much appreciated. Don't have your tea. Thank you. Bye bye, all. Bye bye. Good night.